is Understandably Live, which is part of understandably.com, a daily newsletter. I like to call it what do I like to call it? A daily newsletter for extraordinary people. And today I'm very excited to have with me Grant Ryan, who is the author of a book called Comparanomics. He's a New Zealand economist, inventor, entrepreneur, very interesting guy. And I know that often I get asked, how are Kate and Tom doing? Kate and Tom are in here on the chat, but I'm going to pop them out so Grant and I can talk. And maybe we'll come back in and have a little Q&A afterwards. So let me first off say hello to Grant. Welcome and thanks for being with us today.
Hey, Bill. How you doing?
I'm great. Tell me where you are and what's that beautiful view behind you?
That was the view I took from my deck this morning. I live in a little village called Akaroa in New Zealand in the South Island, so quite lucky to live here, really.
Got it. So this is the man who's written a book that talks about how now is a wonderful time to live compared to all previous times. Might be colored by the view outside your window every day, but I'm glad for you. That looks fantastic. So can you just start off? Give us, the quick. We're in an elevator. Grant, tell me about yourself, and then we'll get into the book and the theme of it.
Yes, I trained as an engineer and always wanted to be an inventor, and ended up, I've done 7 technology companies, sold 3 of them into the US, including to Intel and MBCI back in the day when they were competing with Yahoo and AOL. And I really enjoy that inventive thing, but I actually trained as an economist, did my PhD in that, and I've been thinking about this for about 30 years with why, the way that we're traditionally told about economics really seems so inappropriate. And that's what caused me to write the book. I assumed someone else would write it, but I just got sick of not hearing such inaccurate descriptions of how we're getting on.
Yeah, when you say inappropriate, tell me a little bit more about what that means, the economics being inappropriate.
Well, we're quite often told that real wages have barely budged for 50 years and that people are no better off. And I'm like, that's true in terms of how you calculate it. But if you go back 50 years, we live 10 years less roughly. So if you got leukemia, you died. Economics doesn't have a measure for that. So you can say we're no better off, but there's so many things that we have. You'll have goods and services that you use that a billionaire even 5 years ago couldn't have, let alone 15 years ago. The phone you've got in your pocket, even if it's 3 years old, 4 years ago, a billionaire couldn't have that. Things go from impossible to free so quickly, but economics doesn't count it. So there's lots of examples like that. So for example, when I was growing up, you had to be rich to have a set of encyclopedias.
Mm-hmm.
And now basically we get something that's literally 100 times better and it's free. And from a GDP point of view, it's gone down because you don't have people trudging around with piles of paper trying to sell it to you. But it's good for us. And so most people have got no idea that when people say real wages haven't changed, they assume we're just as poor as we used to be. But it really doesn't measure things that are really important to us. So what I really tried to do was say, well, who cares what Grant thinks? Look at where he lives. His life's great. So what I did was I said, well, what's important to you, Bill? And you can just list things that, which parts of the economy are important to you? And you go, well, health, housing, education. You just land what it is. And then there's a little tool where you can do a little comparison. You go, well, how's the health system? I mean, everyone knows how under stress it is and, how bad it is. But you go, we live 10 years longer. That's kind of cool. Rather than having open heart surgery and dying, it's a day procedure to slip a stent in. But economics doesn't understand any of that. It's important to you and I, but it's not measured. So I get grumpy when the economists tell us that we're no better off, and it just doesn't make any sense to me. So one of the things
it's funny because I'm thinking about this. I've certainly heard economists say, wages have stagnated. Maybe buying power isn't what it was comparatively. But I'm trying to think, do I hear them saying we were better off, for example, in the 1970s, which you mentioned?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of commentary that says, this generation's the first one that's not as rich as their parents were. and that's a commentary that you kind of hear. But when people say wages have stagnated for 50 years, there's kind of an assumption. And when I say this, it's not some academic nicety. It's actually something that causes real world political movements. Make America great again. There's an assumption it was much greater in the past. And this is not a political book at all. I'm just trying to explain which bits were better. The
Right.
health system wasn't. It was harder to get educated because we didn't have the access to information. It was harder to. I mean, when I grew up, you had to save up to buy a cassette. I'm showing my age. But now you've basically got anything you want for a few dollars a week. It's
Now, how old are you, if you don't mind, since you've opened the
52.
52.
How old are you?
I'm 51. I opened the door
Oh,
there.
wow. So, you're a young fella.
I'd love to hear what that year was like. I'm sure a lot of things happened in it, that 1 year difference. But well, sort of thematically, the thing that leaped out at me for this, the first was the notion of any of us today being as wealthy as Louis the XVI ever was. Or is wealthy the right word?
Yeah. Well, so if you I did that kind of as a straw man, because I was like, well, hey, let's take one of the richest people in the history. He was so rich that the peasants decided they're going to chop his head off. I mean, he was, if you've seen the palaces in France, you're like, wow, I would be a bit miffed if I was seeing that. So, but you go, well, of course he was rich. Look at his palaces. But you look at the gardens out the front, and they were designed like that because that was the most luxurious way to defecate. They didn't have flush toilets.
Uh-huh.
And they lived half as long because, to fix an eye infection, they used urine. And, they gave morphine to kids to calm them down. I mean, that's got some merits, I guess. But the state of so many things, and you go, well, he had 500 servants cooking him a meal, which is true, but they didn't know that it's a good thing to wash their hands, and they didn't have toilets. So it would be illegal to serve food like that in a prison now. All of these things that you go through, and you go, well, he had grand carriages, and we're like, no one would swap a carriage for a modern car. He couldn't fly. If he wanted to talk to someone in the next village, he didn't have phones. He didn't, a jester might be kind of cool, but Netflix, I don't think anyone would swap for that.
Yeah.
And so you go, well, what parts of his life were better? Well, he had a bigger house. We'll give him that. But pretty much everything else was pretty horrific.
Yeah.
And you go, it's kind of pointing out that, so many things in our lives are so much better than one of the richest people in the world, but we don't really understand that very well.
Right. I mean, you think about this conversation you and I are having from, suburban New Jersey, just outside New York City, with you in New Zealand, Kate in Scotland, Tom up in Maine in the US, and God knows where all the people are watching from. This conversation we're having would have been expensive 5 years ago and wouldn't have been possible. Well, it certainly 20 years ago, right? I mean, I remember around 2005, in the military with a budget trying to arrange, conversations like this with a small group around the world, and it was just a disaster. So that's certainly true. And I compare it to, if I in this frame of mind, I compare it to being a high schooler and going to high school over the state line, very close as the crow flies, like only a few miles away. But because it was over the state line, just to call a friend and say, "What are you doing for the weekend?" or "Do you remember what page the math homework was?" probably $1 a minute, right? So
Yeah.
certainly within my own lifetime, that part of it works. Yeah, I think that just the broader thematic thing, the notion of, and Kate helped me to understand this earlier today, but the notion of happiness in part being a function of how well you think you're doing. And maybe many of us are sort of trained with, we look on social media or look at friends, but the key is that all of us are starting out right now with a sort of common base of technology and health and whatnot. But it seems to me your book is partially at least saying, don't just look at people of your age and your right now, but look at where you fit within the course of human history, and you find out, you were born on third base, so to speak.
Yeah, and there's 3 parts of the book. So the first part is really giving you the tools so you can work out for yourself how you're getting on. Because if people typically do the little diagram and they go, oh yeah, actually we're doing a lot better, but there's very real reasons that we feel stress and under pressure. And the second part of the book is really looking at what those reasons are, because unless you understand what those reasons are, you don't have very good tools for, making progress. And the whole point of the first part was to really point out that we don't feel stress and strain because we're doing so bad compared to everyone else or compared to what we're told sometimes. That's not the real reason.
Hmm.
And digging into those reasons is well worth understanding.
Yeah. So talk about now the current age. I mean, even since you and I started talking here, we've got war in Ukraine. We've got the complete upending, it seems, of the whole current geopolitical order. We got inflation matching back what we had in the 1970s. Talk a little bit about now, if you can.
Yeah, well, if you go through, even things like, violence, what's happening in Ukraine is horrific. There's no doubt about it, and it's kind of weird. I thought we'd be over that by now, but it wasn't that long ago that an alternative to this was that this would happen, and then you would get a call up or a letter, and you'd be off there. That was only a couple of generations ago, and it seems unlikely that we're going to send millions of people to Europe and have an all-out fight. Um, but but there's kind of attitudes to violence have kind of changed, subtly over time as well. Like when I was growing up and I went to school, if you misbehaved, they got out a stick and whacked you with it. And that just seems comically barbaric now. And so our attitudes to things like that do change over time. But yeah.
Yeah. Um, so tell me, sorry, I'm just thinking through here. I think there's another part of this book where you talk about using the same sort of graphical interface like you have set up, and maybe I should be sharing this here. But it's Comparanomics.com? Is it?
Yes.
Yeah. Here,
With
I'll put in my fancy graphic. And it where you talk about sort of making personal decisions and weighing pros and cons. I mean, is it helpful to use this graphical thing you're talking about?
Yeah, well, what it does is it forces you to think, well, which bits, just choose 6 bits of, say, the economy that you find are important, and then you can kind of do a little graph and say, are they pretty much the same? Are they much better, much worse? And what it does is it allows you to kind of have a wee think, and then you can have a discussion with someone, and you can have a look, and you can say, okay, well, I roughly agree with that, or I don't, and it kind of makes you have a bit of a think about it. But where it's even more useful is you might say, and this is kind of what you were alluding to before, well, maybe we're better off with a whole lot of things, but the world's turned to custard, and you go, well, which part of the world do you mean, Bill? And so if I say, well, what parts might be important to you, and you might say, racism and sexism and homophobia and violence, and then you go and you do a comparison, you go, well, what was it like back then? And we talked a little bit about the violence, and we say, well, actually, it's not good at the moment, but it's definitely not as bad as it used to be.
Hmm.
1970s Vietnam, you would have probably had a chance of being, sent off there if you were of a certain age, and it's unlikely you're going to Ukraine. Um, and then if you go, something like, sexism it's remarkable. Back in the 1970s, if you were a woman, you couldn't get a credit card unless your husband said it's okay or your father. It's kind of comically
Yeah.
horrific, really. And then it's the same if you look at, homophobia. It was illegal to be back in the day, and now most people don't give a damn. And you look at how these things have changed, and I personally think that they're all positive changes. Now, you don't have to think that. So, again, you could say that you think that those things are all bad things. Like if you're a member of the Ku Klux Klan, you don't think, you know, better racism is a good thing, but most people are not really like that. So anyway, you can, rather than just saying the world's turned to custard, you say which part of the world are important to you, and
Yeah.
how do you think they've changed? Then you can have a conversation.
So it sounds like you're not saying there's an answer or that progress almost inevitably makes things better. Progress, I mean, just mean the passage of time.
Well, I guess what's surprising is that it does look like a lot of things that a lot of people care about are dramatically better, but we don't feel that way. And that's the whole point of the book, was to work out, well, why is that? If we're getting on so well, why do we feel so bad? And there's some really well understood, well researched reasons why that is the case. that people aren't as aware of as they should, and that's why I've written the book.
Got it. And beyond what we've already talked about, I'm trying to think what reasons are you talking about that prompt you to write this that you want to challenge?
So the two biggest themes are really around our brains are programmed to respond to negativity, and that we evolved through that because basically if there was a lion about to eat us, we were heightened for that. And if there's a tree full of berries, that's good, but it's not as important as the lion. So basically negative news sticks on us. And so we remember it and we repeat it. And so back in the day when you used to pick up a newspaper over breakfast and have a quick scan of some local news,
Mm.
and then you'd carry on with your day, whereas now we're kind of bombarded the whole time with all of this stuff, and it's negative and we feel negative. And so even though if you look at it objectively and you go, well, actually we're a lot better off, but you get all this negativity. And it's also remarkably common how often we will choose to grump about things. So if I tell you I tried to deal with the government or an insurance company and all I wanted to do was this, and immediately you've got a story about how hopeless they are.
Yeah.
And if you kind of observe that and you respond and you say, oh, I talked to an insurance company last week and they were really nice. It's just so socially weird to do that. And you're like, it does happen. And but we're attuned to grumble about things, and most people don't even realize how much they grumble about things. I say there's a natural level of grumpiness, in that it doesn't matter how good your life is, you'll have a grumble about something. So where I live, during the start of the pandemic, we didn't have a single case, and someone wanted to donate some fairy lights for some historic buildings, and the social, the grumbling within the community and the divide, it was hilarious. But I'm like, it shows how good life is here, really, because we'll have a grumble about something that trivial.
Yeah.
But
What do you want to donate? I missed that.
oh, sorry, some fairy lights to put on a historic building to make them light up at night.
I see.
And some people loved it, some people hated it, and some people got banned from Facebook posts about it. And you're like, how comical is that?
Yeah.
But a lot of people do. It gives you an idea of the relative level of I think people will always naturally grumbly. And what I also find amusing is people go, I don't grumble, I'm fine. I'm like, oh, okay. And then you'll participate in the conversation and they'll typically grumble about all sorts of stuff. And we
Yeah,
don't
I
even
suppose
realize it.
that's true. I will say, as somebody that writes a lot of articles, when you find the insurance company that's dealt with somebody well and creatively, like people will read that, people will share that, and they'll be excited to hear about that. So I think it is true. I mean, misery loves company, but there is maybe it's my optimistic nature that there is a part of us too that likes to hear about when somebody was treated well and somebody went out of their way and had a really positive experience. There's entire networks made up of nothing but good news as a result of that. So I think they're both there. I think they're maybe you're battling for the soul of whether people are communal grumblers or communal
Well,
sharing happiness.
well, I don't. It doesn't mean that you don't participate in, but if you're more aware of it, it's less likely to send you into a spiral of doom about how hopeless it is. I've got my stories I love to share.
Yeah.
I get a notice from the council telling me to get rid of some noxious weeds, and they're all coming in from my neighbour's place, and that's owned by the council. And you're just like, that's crazy. But it's not going to send me in a spiral of doom because I know that the water's going to work and the roads work, and most of the main stuff is actually kind of good. But it's a good story to share.
Yeah. Here's where I'm kind of landing on this that that old saying, ignorance is bliss, which has always been seen as a negative thing. At least I think it's always been seen as a negative thing. But there's a piece of this where, you know, if I think back to, we're about the same age. If I think back to being 20 years old or so, and I, I might not have, I simply wasn't aware of the wealth that people had. I simply wasn't aware of, I was an educated person, but I just hadn't been exposed to anything to the degree to which a 12-year-old with an internet connection, I guess good and bad, can be exposed to all kinds of information. And it's
Yeah,
interesting too that just to finish that, I was thinking that there are so few times for a lot of people where you're ever just alone with your thoughts. You ever have time to just process. Because what does everybody do? You sit down. I mean, I was at the doctor's office recently and I look around the waiting room. and there's 5 other people all wearing masks in a medical center, all staring at their phones. 3 of them with their glasses fogging up, trying to overcome that. It's just it changes all the inputs, so I suppose it would change the outputs as well too.
Yeah, so what it's done is it's amplified a lot of what are very normal things for us. So instead of, reading the news once a day, you've got it the whole time. So you're getting a natural thing that we have, and then it's amplified, which is partly why we feel stressed and strained. The other big second part of the theme is that it's always been normal that when, you were walking around and you saw a kid next door with a flash new bike, you have a pang of, oh, I'd like one of those. And that's a very normal thing to do. But now what you have is when you're on social media, you can see a lot more people, and you can only see the polished version of their lives. You don't hear them arguing over the fence because they don't really put that on Facebook. But that's what people do. And so you you take something that's very normal to feel a sense of wanting what they have or that their life's better. But now it's just amplified so much more, and you feel that pang of, well, I can't be doing very well. I'm not. Everyone's doing a lot better than me. I'm pretty useless. And so it's the very normal, well understood things that are amplified that once you kind of understand them, you can still participate, but you don't get into that kind of spiral of, why you feel so bad. There's so much research that shows that after spending time on social media, people feel bad, and we know why that is, but a lot of people don't really understand, how to counteract that, which is mostly around knowing it, really.
Got it. Got it. Now, one question I have is how does this writing? Let me put this a different way. I've written a couple of books. I know even if it's a side project, it takes over a big part of your life, and I'm curious how this experience of writing this changes how you view the world, how you interact with your family, how you make decisions yourself.
Well, even if no one else read it, I would have found it a useful process, to be honest. I'm quite geeky in that I like to understand the world. And so, like, pretty much every day, I'll have conversations, and with this understanding, you can kind of, it makes you able to see a little bit better about how the world actually works. So, and in the second part of the book, there's a whole lot of kind of feel bad factors around things that make you feel bad around the negative news and the comparing yourself. And there's a whole lot of little ones that you can just kind of catch yourself as well. So, one of the other ones that is well researched is that in Western society, there's kind of an expectation that you're happy, and we should be happy. We're wealthy, we're well off, but the literature shows that actually we're human, and it's normal to have a bit of joy and a bit of sorrow. And once you know that, and you're having a bad day, you don't go, oh, I'm having a bad day because the world's so shit, and you get in the spiral. You go, oh, I'm just being human. It's one of those things, and tomorrow will probably be a better day. And even just knowing little quirks like that makes it much easier to cope with the various things that go on.
I was actually just reading a study, and I'm having trouble with the math around this, but suggesting if you take a society like Denmark, which is often rated as one of the happiest countries on earth, and then you ask individual people whether they consider themselves to be happy, the odds of them saying yes are lower than in many countries where the overall, I don't know how they rank these things, but the overall rating of the country is supposedly a lot lower on the happiness scale. It kind of goes to exactly what you're saying there. We have a study or two to back it up, I suppose. Um,
Yeah, well, it's yeah. If you have as a society this magical expectation that you should be happy and you
yeah.
live in a great country and all is good, then um, there's a weird thing where some of the happiest countries in the world have the highest suicide rates. And I partly think that's because, and this is a speculation rather than research, is that I live in a great place, everything's good. Why am I feeling so bad? It makes you
Mm.
feel even worse. Whereas they tend not to commit suicide in countries that are, have issues with getting food. And there's an old saying that is, when you're hungry, you've got one problem, and when you're not hungry, you've got lots of problems. And so yeah, it's kind of a perspective thing.
Got it. Well, Grant, I think that's about all the time we have at this point. I don't actually see any questions coming in, but we had a little bit of difficulty sending out the link this morning, so I think we'll have more people popping in afterward. Can you remind us where the book is? It's on Amazon and whatnot, and your website with this graphical interface is comparanomics.com. Is that right?
That's one, yes.
Okay. All right. Grant, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
No problem. I enjoyed chatting. Cheers.
Okay. Have a great day. Bye.
You too.